And here we are. We're live. Hello, book lovers. Welcome to the 126th episode of Authors Love Bookstores, presented by A Mighty Blaze. I'm your host, Kimberly Hensle Lowrance. If you're new to A Mighty Blaze, welcome. We're a group of volunteer creatives who have been hosting online literary events for the past 3 years to help support books, authors, and the wider publishing community. Here in Authors Love Bookstores, my co-host Joe Moldover and I bring you conversations between authors and their favorite indie booksellers to shine a light on storytelling, creativity, and the small businesses that enrich our communities. Today, we are very thrilled to journey to New Orleans, Louisiana, where we welcome our guests, author Alex Jennings and bookseller Candace Huber. Welcome to you both. We're very happy that you're here. I'm going to tell the audience that Candace is actually on the floor of the bookstore as we're talking today. So you may see some people in the background. That's exciting. That's what we want. We want people in bookstores buying books, preferably Alex's book. And we're going to talk about that. So let me tell you a little bit about our guests. So Alex Jennings is a writer, editor, teacher, and poet, again, living in New Orleans. He is program director of Dream Foundry's Connor Bust and pens a regular speculative poetry review column in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction called Chapter and Verse. In 2022, he was the inaugural recipient of the Imagination Unbound Fellowship at Under the Volcano, a guided writing retreat in Mexico. Alex's writing has appeared in a number of publications, including Fantastic Stories of the Imagination, Uncanny Magazine, Fantasy Magazine, New Sons, and Current Affairs. His debut novel, The Ballad of Perilous Graves, which Candace has a copy of to show us all, which is such a gorgeous cover. It's a finalist for the LA Times Book Festival Ray Bradbury Award for Speculative Fiction. Alex is also an instructor of fiction at the University of Southern Maine Stone Coast MFA program. I know, such a good cover. I love when you read a book and then the cover just like supports the story so well, right? So good. Okay, Candace Huber is a 6th generation New Orlean, which I've never actually said before, 6th generation New Orleans. And Candace owns Tubby Coo's Mid-City Bookshop, a queer-owned, progressive, nerdy, independent bookshop in Mid-City New Orleans, focused on science fiction and fantasy, queer, and diverse books. The store was founded in 2014 and has a wonderful name that we're going to learn more about during the show. Welcome to you both.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Okay, I should remind our audience. What's that, Candace? I'm sorry.
I just said Alex and I said the same thing at the same time. Go ahead.
Great minds. I should remind our audience that we welcome questions. Put them below the broadcast in a comment, and we'll get to as many as we can later on. Our eagle-eyed viewers may notice that I am wearing a Tubby Coo's t-shirt, which I've actually owned in my closet for a couple of years. And so when Alex was invited to be on the show and he recommended Tubby Coo's, I was like, why do I know that bookstore? And it's because I've been wearing the t-shirt. So I was excited to break it out today. And Alex, tell us why Tubby Coo's. What is it about this bookstore other than its fabulous name? What is it about this bookstore that's special, that you're connected to? Tell us about your relationship with the store.
I'm pretty sure that Tubby Coo's is our first dedicated SFF bookstore in town. And Candace has been such a committed and tireless booster of letters here in town. They put on fantastic events. They are always willing to give a helping hand to up-and-coming writers and make their shop just a very welcoming space for a diverse array of people and attitudes across the spectrum. So Tubby Coo's values very much align with my own, from the progressive side. And I've just had a great time with everything they've done since they opened.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Alex. That's so nice.
I love asking this question because the authors always have these like fantastic things to say about the bookstores. And then you can see the bookseller kind of like blush, like, oh, this is so good. Because it's not very often that you get someone just to, say all the things that they love about you. We don't do that enough, I think.
That's really true. And I will just say real quick that when the store first opened, Alex had self-published a book of short stories, and it was called Here I Come and Other Stories, which is still a really good book. And so it was also, Alex was one of the first local authors I think I ever worked with as part of opening the store. So it was really exciting to see Alex go through this like journey with this book, because I know he's been working on it for a long time.
Candace, what made you decide to open a sci-fi fantasy bookstore? Like, what is it about that genre that connects with you? And it's a big genre with so many subgenres. I am learning. And just tell us about sort of why you were connected to that, who your audience is, kind of how Tubby and Coo's came to be. Oh, and you must tell us about the name.
Sure. So I am just a big old nerd. So I like everything nerd. I always have. I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy as a kid, a lot of like Ursula Le Guin and Anne McCaffrey and things like that when I was a kid. And so I have just always loved the genre. And here in New Orleans, as Alex said, we didn't have a dedicated bookstore to that. And so I was like, I've always wanted to open a bookstore. And then I said, well, if I did, I want to fill this niche that, if I open a bookstore, here's what I would want. I was like, that doesn't exist. I want to just sell all of sci-fi fantasy because that's what I like. And apparently that's what a lot of people like. And then our only queer bookstore in the city closed a few years ago. And so then I started really leaning into that. And so now I'm sort of like known as the queer sci-fi fantasy gremlin. Like, this is my very specific niche. And that has worked out really well. And so really my customers are people who love diverse science fiction and fantasy. That is really where we shine. We also do romance and horror. And so those four genres are really where we stick to the most. And then we also do children's books. So just trying to promote as many diverse authors as we can. And stick with that niche and the name. So Tubby and Coo are my grandparents. They were actually born in New Orleans in this neighborhood where the bookstore is across the street from each other. And so I'd always said, actually, I can't, one second, because I have a picture of them right here, if I can get it off. But I'd always said, if I ever open a bookstore, I would put it in their old neighborhood and name it after them. So this is Tubby and Coo. They live here in the bookstore with me. And yeah, so I put it in their old neighborhood and named it after them.
That's really beautiful.
Where the name comes from. Yeah.
Did they inspire you to read? Were they book lovers too?
Kind of. My grandfather was all about education and educating yourself. And so a lot of that, of course, has to do with books, which give you a good education. My grandmother was a huge reader. And she went blind later in life. She had macular degeneration. And so I would read to my grandmother after she lost her sight. And so books have definitely always found their way in. I used to hide in libraries when I was a kid. I was reading at a super young age. So I love books. And yes, Tubby and Coo were definitely a big supporter of books as well.
Excellent. I think we all have memories of hiding in library aisles, don't we? Like
probably so. Probably. I have a customer, so
yeah, go for it. That's great because it's a perfect segue to ask Alex a question. So, Alex, congratulations!
Thank you
on your wonderful book, The Ballad of Perilous Graves. I thought this book was wildly imaginative, so original. I just was blown away. And I read the book. When I was reading the book, I kept thinking, this person's brain must be amazing. Like just that your brain could tie together so many different things into this really engaging, compelling story. And I know I'm not the only one. You've gotten wonderful reviews. Publishers Weekly gave you a starred review and called the book stunning. And then they went on to say that Jennings develops a rich, enveloping world brimming with mesmerizing art, music, and fantasy. and sets within it a rich discussion of community and culture. The unmistakable love for New Orleans that emanates from these pages will stick in readers' heads and hearts like the catchiest of tunes. It's so good.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's so good. Can you tell our audience a little bit about this book? Because I feel like anything I say would not do it justice. What is the story? What is the Ballad of Perilous Graves?
Well, I think at its heart, it's a sort of blaxploitation Pippi Longstocking adventure set in a version of New Orleans where music is a form of sorcery, and 9 songs of power have escaped from Professor Longhair's enchanted piano and manifested around the city as colorful street people. And so my title character, a failed magician named Perry Graves, and his baby sister and his one true love, Peaches Lavelle, have to find the songs and return them home before the city crumbles.
Oh. This book has, as you say, music, magic, graffiti that comes alive, flying trolleys, ghosts, zombies, talking animals. I could go on and on and on and on. There's so many elements in this book that make the book the kind of story where you are so immersed in it. You are, I mean, as a reader, I felt I could see it all. Like it's so visual, and I just felt it was so alive.
Well, thank you.
I wondered where you started with the book. What was the spark? I often think that there's a question the authors are trying to answer when they're writing a book. What for you? Was there a question, a story that you were trying to specifically tell?
Yes, absolutely. When I first moved to New Orleans in the summer of 2006, the city was very much in the early stages of recovering from the wake of Hurricane Katrina and the failure of the federal levees. And there were a lot of news stories about kids who were forced to return to the city without their parents and sort of fend for themselves, like feeding themselves, getting themselves to school, and protecting themselves as well. And so that immediately made me think of the one parentless kid that I knew best in literature, Pippi Longstocking. And I asked myself, what would Pippi be like if she was a little redbone girl living in Central City, New Orleans? And the story was born out of that.
That's fantastic. You remember the first scene that you wrote? And is that in the final story?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think the first scene I wrote was Peaches coming to Perry's yard and throwing pebbles at his window to get him to come out. And that scene didn't wind up making the cut.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. One of the things about this book is that there's so much heart in this story. You know, it's a little bit of it's a hero's journey that they're on, right? They're on this journey to save New Orleans, and along the way, obviously, to care for one another and to care for the people that they love, their families, their community. So much heart. And I just wondered, do you see that heart? I mean, is it reflected in when you think about New Orleans? Is that something that you so identify with the city, this sense of heart, this sense of community? Was that a goal of yours to reflect that in the story?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's one of the things that drew me to the city so compellingly. And the city reminded me of my own family and what we've been through over the generations, as well as, you know, on a macro level, the experience of Blackness writ large in our society. And so combining all those things together and thinking about the cultural connections and impacts really helped the story sing.
Yeah. And music is such a thread in this book as well. Are you a musician by training? I felt like when I read the book that there's like a surface music understanding that I had as just like a regular person, but I wondered if an informed musician was reading the book, there probably were so many other layers to the story that you've created that I probably missed. And I wondered what your background was in music.
Well, I'm not personally a musician, but I am an obsessive music nerd. Every time I hear something I like, I obsessively want to know absolutely everything there is to know about it. And that goes all the way back to my early childhood when I first heard Iko Iko with zero cultural context, not even knowing that New Orleans was a place. I asked my mom what it was all about, and she took me to a bookstore in the mall, and the bookseller there explained to me what the Mardi Gras Indians were, and that there was this city named New Orleans, and like that's where jazz comes from. And that was like the first time the love of New Orleans appeared like a little flame in my heart.
Oh. And you've cultivated that flame for a long time to write this book.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's exciting. So that's a great segue over to you, Candace. The mission of your store is to empower the people of Greater New Orleans to create change in our community or their community by telling their own stories and through building community, promoting literacy, demanding social justice. Can you talk about your mission and how that's reflected in the store? How do you make that come true?
Oh man, that's a big question. I feel like the mission is, everyone deserves to feel seen. Everyone deserves to, be able to tell their own stories and to be able to see themselves reflected in stories. And it's something that, so many people haven't had for a really long time, and it's getting a lot better. But like when I was growing up, I never saw myself reflected in any story. I'm a non-binary person, and that wasn't even really a thing. I mean, it was a thing that we existed, but in society, right? Like that you never saw that reflected anywhere. And I feel like a lot of people have a similar experience. And so it's really important to me to make sure that I am putting books in the store that are reflecting different kinds of experiences. I don't want to, especially with science fiction and fantasy, it can be so like old white man focused, honestly. And like, we've all read those books, and I'm not saying those books can't be good, because like clearly, things like Game of Thrones and Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings, and these are all, our classic books. But everyone knows those things, right? So I really want to help people discover as well, things that they may not know about, and things that are, more of their own experience, instead of them having to try and put themselves into an experience that isn't theirs, which so many of us have had to do for so long. So I'm super just grateful for Alex for writing this book, and for folks writing similar books, because it's like, there's people in the world that exist right outside of the sort of traditional hero and the hero's journey. And so I'm really excited to be able to curate the store in a way, because my store is very small and it's very curated. And I want to make sure that I'm curating it in a way to promote voices that we don't really see promoted in a lot of other places. And so that's sort of where the mission goes, and how I do it. And this book, since we were just talking about Alex's book, I just have to say that this is the most New Orleans book I've ever read in my life. And I tell everyone that, like, it's so New Orleans. And this is sort of the first book of its kind to exist, I think, because like a lot of people want to use New Orleans as a setting, because it's such a cool city. But I also think a lot of people don't fully understand how to use New Orleans in a setting, especially in like fantasy books. So like, this is for me one of the first, probably the first fantasy book that does New Orleans just so well. And it was my best-selling book of last year. Because I was just like throwing it at everyone. Like, are you local? Are you a musician? Especially if you're both, read this. Like, hit people over the head with it. Anyway, I know that did not really go with the question you asked, but I just had to say that, like, I love this book so much, and throw it at people all the time.
No, good. I'm glad Yeah, I'm glad you said that. Actually, it's a segue into a question I had for both of you, which is that very much feel when I read this book that New Orleans is a character. It's more than a setting. It's a character. It feels it's a living entity that's beloved by everyone in the book, and clearly everyone who lives in New Orleans. And I wondered if you could talk about New Orleans and its literary community. Like, what makes the city? Because you have so many authors in Louisiana, in New Orleans. Like, what is it about your hometown that inspires so many writers, that draws so many creatives to the city? What is it that, I mean, I've been to New Orleans, so I could say it as like a non-New Orleans person. I get it. But what is it when you live there and you breathe that air and that hot, soupy, humid air? Like, what is it about New Orleans that's so, well, there's no place like it.
Well, there are kind of a few answers to that. Jokingly, I would say that the city knows how to drink and it knows how to party. But I would say, real talk, that there is a certain degree of dysfunction and pressure from the outside to make the city into something that it isn't. So seeing the city for what it actually is and what it has been and what it contributes to the world forces a person to bond with the city in a way that you don't have to elsewhere, because that's what gets you past so many of the difficulties of living here and the corruption and the crumbling infrastructure. And when you look at the works of writers who have gone before, like John Kennedy Toole and even Lafcadio Hearn, you see that like the problems that we have in the city now are the same ones that have always been here, but dressed up in modern clothes.
What about you, Candace? What is it?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better than that, really. I think that I think people are drawn to New Orleans a lot of times for the wrong reasons, which is always really interesting to me. Like, a lot of people are drawn to, oh, it's a party city. Oh, it's New Orleans is so much fun. And then people move here with a certain idea of New Orleans in their head, and it's not that. It's only that in certain places and at certain times, right? But like, if you live here, it's not, you don't party all of the time, right? And we have so many good restaurants, and we have so many good. So I think people have such great vacations here and such a good time here that they think that this is just what it is all the time. New Orleans, I agree with Alex in a lot of ways, that there's this dichotomy here where we have this crumbling infrastructure and we get hit by hurricanes all the time, and we have terrible, corruption and all this other bad stuff going on, but we hide it really well. New Orleans is very good at tourism and marketing, right? And so I think people see that and they come here and they experience that, but it's not quite the same when you live here. And so I think when you breathe this air, I mean, I've breathed it my entire life. My family's breathed it for 6 generations at this point. And so I think that when you have lived in this sort of dichotomy for a while, and I'm not saying you have to be born and raised here, but like, once you start really living in it, New Orleans is so community oriented that I think that, we find each other, right? Like, we find our people here, and we are very connected to our people, and we are very suspicious of outsiders in New Orleans. And so I think that, like, once you live here and once you become ingrained and become a part of it, like, you won't find a better community. And I think that's what a lot of writers here have found, right? Like, we've all found each other in the literary community, and we support each other. And, once you find that, you kind of don't want to let it go.
Yeah. It's a very special place. Yeah, very special place. So, Alex, as I mentioned earlier, when I read your book, I felt a bit like in awe of how your brain could do this. And it made me think a lot about the way that we are inspired and the different experiences that shape us as writers. And I recently attended a course taught by Alexander Chi, the author, and he talked about that when you ask writers who inspires you, they talk about all these writers that they've read as adults, right? All these lofty Pulitzer Prize winners and Nobel Prize winners or whatever. And he said, but really, when you think about it, the writers who shape us are the writers we read as children and as young people. And so I've been thinking a lot about that myself. And what, as I gravitate toward different books, like I choose this one or I choose that one. And is it because of what I read as a child? And then I read your book and I thought, I'm fascinated to hear about what you read as a kid. Did you read sci-fi and fantasy? When you think about your early influences, who are those writers?
Oh, there were so many. In terms of sci-fi and fantasy, Tolkien was a big one. Um, Octavia Butler was very big for me. Nancy Kress, but also people like Walter Mosley and Agatha Christie and Norton Juster and the Phantom Tollbooth, and C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. Like all those things were a huge deal for me. But then there were other media as well, like with comic books, Chris Claremont and those guys, all those X-Men comics, the Justice League, things like that, and a lot of David Mazzucchelli, who, by the way, also did a comic book adaptation of Paul Auster's City of Glass at one point. I don't know how easy it is to find these days, but you should seek it out because it's amazing.
So your inspirations were varied. They weren't just sci-fi. And that's a really important point because you can see that in the book, right? There's like the pacing and the structure definitely comes from a lot of different genres. Excellent. Another thing about you that's really interesting is that you grew up all over the world. So many different countries, Botswana, Tunisia, Suriname. And you came to New Orleans as an adult?
Yes.
Right. So how do you think living in different places shaped you as a writer? Was that an influence?
I mean, it was absolutely an influence. I never considered myself as having a home until I had lived in New Orleans for about 7 years.
Oh.
I always felt very itinerant wherever I was, even in Maryland, where I spent the bulk of my time before coming here. But seeing other cultures and other perspectives on life, especially from the standpoint of not being a tourist, but in actually living in these places for 2 and 3 years at a time, just really sort of broke my eye open and helped me understand the world and life beyond myself and what was familiar to me.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So Candace, can you hold up Alex's wonderful book? This cover, Alex, I showed your book to a bunch of friends, people who hadn't read the book, and everyone talked about this cover. I had so many comments on how striking it is. And I know that an author doesn't design the cover. That's the publisher's job. But I wondered what your experience was like when they presented this cover to you. Were you thrilled? Were you expecting this? Did you collaborate on it?
Honestly, no cap. Like when I first saw that cover, like the front of my skull felt hot. It was a literal physical thrill. And the cover was designed and created by Lisa Marie Pompilio, who's on staff at Orbit Books. And she's on social media as Von Brooklyn, VON Brooklyn, like the borough in New York. And she's just amazing. They asked me for some ideas about the cover, and I told them like I was interested in seeing something that looked kind of like a stained glass window, and maybe a silhouette of Perry blowing his trumpet on the front. And then when this came in, it didn't really relate to any of the ideas that I had, but it was absolutely perfect to the point where I wish that I'd thought of it. A gravestone that's also a piano.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Also, if you look at the cover through Google Lens, it animates, and I've never seen anything like it.
Oh, wow. Okay. That sounds fantastic. And then if you open up the book, you have, that's the link on the back. You can bring it to life. Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Candace. And then if you open up the book inside, where are they called? End papers. You have this wonderful map of, it's beautiful. Where the characters, their story, where they go in New Orleans. And do you have it in color? Oh, there you have it in green. Wonderful. And I wondered about that because actually I've never had the chance to ask an author this question. Did the cover creator also do the map? Did you do the map and they made it fancy? How did the map come to be?
Okay, I asked them if I could put a map in it because like books like Lord of the Rings and fantasy novels with maps in them were such a staple of my childhood, and they immediately said yes. I'm not sure whether Lisa designed the map or not. I was never, I know they have actual cartographers to do these things,
Whoa.
so it might not have been her, but it seems like it's in her style. But I took existing maps of the city and kind of annotated them as best I could and sent them those. And they changed my ugly little scribblings into this beautiful, beautiful image.
I loved it. I thought it gave me a sense of what I was about to read. Do you know, oh, okay. I see. I have to pay attention to the locations because they're important to this story, and I'm grounded in the story. I loved it. That was such a great addition. Candace, what did you think? Were you a fan of the maps?
Oh yeah, love the maps, and I also love my favorite thing. I mean, this cover's really good, but my favorite thing about it that a lot of people don't notice is this little detail that on top of the barcode, there's a purse, right? And if you read the book, you'll get it more. But I was like, oh my gosh, it's so good. It's just so good. All the little details that after you read it, you appreciate those details a lot more because you're like, oh no, that's actually perfect. And the map is amazing. And they sent me, and I think that's what Alex was holding up. They sent me a fold out, real map. That was a giant, you could fold it. That was a pamphlet for the book. And those are really cool. And they're like, oh, here's some that you can give away. And I was like, give away? I'm keeping that. I gave Alex some. That's really cool. What do you mean give it away?
And Alex, the book is a finalist for this LA Times Book Festival Ray Bradbury Award. Congratulations. How's that feel?
That feels surreal. I'm amazed. To be a finalist along with people like George Saunders and Ray Naylor is just amazing to me. It's completely surreal.
Well, it's well earned. We'll have our fingers crossed for you. It's wonderful news. Candace, there's this wonderful, speaking of wonderful, there's a wonderful post on your website that we're going to put below in the comments when you talk about the 10 ways to support the bookstore. And I really loved that. And we're going to share it. And I think it's such a powerful, clear way for customers to support, small businesses that are so very vital. Obviously buying merch like these fabulous t-shirts is one way, but can you tell our audience a little bit about this? Why did you create this post on, 10 ways to support our store, and what should be give it a highlights, because it's applicable to your store, but really to anyone who wants to support an indie bookstore anywhere?
Yeah, it was a COVID thing. Because, when COVID hit, people were like, what can we do? And is there anything that we can do besides buying books? Right. So people wanted the information. And so I distributed that and came up with it for just like you're saying, not just my store, but also for any bookstore would probably give you the same order of things to do to support them. And so I just thought we'll just tell people, here's the 10 best ways to support us. And, you can always, buying stuff is the best way to support any small business. But even if you can't buy stuff, there are things on there like share our posts on social media, help us get the word out about the store, right? There are things that I think people don't think about that you can do, even if you can't monetarily support us. Show up to our events, right? Most of our events are free. So like put it on in the background so that it boosts our numbers, right? Engage with our posts, like comment on them, like instead of just liking them, because that really helps us. So there's things that don't cost you anything that you can do to support your local indie. And so, yeah, that came about mostly because of COVID, but it's still relevant at any time. So
Absolutely.
those are still correct today.
Absolutely. So obviously the number one thing people do in bookstores, they buy books. And so we're going to put I'm sure we've already posted it, but we'll put it again, the link to buying Alex's book from Tubby and COO'S. And again, if you are interested in fantasy, if you're interested in being swept away, if you love music, if you love New Orleans, this is a book for you.
I also highly recommend the audiobook, which you can also get through Tubby and COO'S. We have a Libro.fm site, which Libro supports indie bookstores. It's the same thing as Audible, but it supports indie bookstores instead of Amazon. So that's really great. You should get all of your audiobooks from Libro. And so Tubby and COO'S has a Libro.fm site, so you can use our affiliate site to buy the audiobook, because it is so good. The reader is amazing. He's a local guy, and Alex can tell you more about him, but like so good. It was so immersive. And it was just a very sort of cinematic, immersive experience to listen to that audiobook. And it really, it was even deeper than just reading the book, which was like Alex does a good job of like, drawing you in, but man, listening to it, it was like, I really felt like I was like on a porch listening to this guy telling me the story. It was so good. And there was music that they actually composed just for this book, right, Alex? So Alex can tell you more, but I was
Alex,
tell
us.
The music is keyboarding by Josh Anderson, a local pianist here in town, and the book is narrated by Graylin Bryant Banks, who is a local actor and a radio broadcaster here in town. He was born and raised here, and he is just fantastic. His audition stood out head and shoulders above the rest. And I was honestly surprised that they asked me my opinion on the audition files, because I've never heard of a publisher doing that before. But I like to say that I hope if I had tried to choose someone else that they would have overruled me and chosen Bryant, because he's just, Graylin Banks is fantastic. Wonderful. And yeah, it was a lovely experience.
It sounds like your publisher has been incredibly supportive of your book.
Oh, they have. Yeah. They absolutely have.
That's great. That's so wonderful to hear. So one of the things our audience really loves is when our guests tell them what they're reading. So obviously we want everyone to read the Ballad of Perilous Graves. But we'd also love to hear, and Candace, we know you have to go do a customer. Okay. We'd love to hear what you're reading. Alex, what's on your bedside table? What are you reading now? What's coming? What are you looking forward to reading?
I'm reading several things right now. One is my girlfriend and I are reading Megan Giddings's The Women Could Fly, which is just a fantastic sophomore novel from an incandescent talent. I'm also reading How High We Go in the Dark, and the author's name escapes me at the moment, but it's lyrical, it's SF-nal, and it's just a beautiful, sprawling tale with a bunch of different perspectives, and I can't get enough of it.
When you're writing sci-fi fantasy, can you read sci-fi fantasy, or do you need to read something different?
Yeah, I mean, I always need to read outside the field, whether I'm currently immersed in a project or not. But I also like to stay current inside the field. So yeah, I read a lot of SF, even as I'm working.
Great. Candace, what about you? What's popular in the store right now, or what are you reading that you're excited about that you'd want our audience to check out after they read Alex's book?
Sure. I mean, both of those things are like pretty much the same for my store, because the things that end up being popular are the things that I throw at people, or the things that I recommend. So I will give a couple. One, oh look, it's right under Alex's book. This one is not new, but it's a good seller in the store. It's called Jade City by Fonda Lee. The trilogy is called the Greenbone Saga, and it is my favorite series. Whoa, my bad. My favorite series, probably of all time at this point.
Oh, wow.
It is just so good. And if you like fantasy and you like interesting magic systems and really good world building and a great plot and good characters, like this is like Alex's book, one of the few books that sort of does everything well. Like the characters, the plot, the world building, the prose, like it's all good. And I don't think, a lot of things do a couple of those things well, but very rarely do they do all of them well. So I think if you liked Alex's book and just the sprawling political fantasy stuff, I think you really like this one. I'm also going to recommend totally different vibe of The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. This is a super cozy fantasy. I absolutely loved it. It has I don't know, if you like Legends and Lattes or like House in the Cerulean Sea kind of vibes, This has the same vibes. It's about a witch who has to hide the fact that she's a witch. And she gets called into this house to like tutor other witches, and sort of is I love found family situations. And like Alex's book, which is also, it's both family and found family, which I love. And so this is a really great found family situation. And then one more super different vibe, because I like giving different vibes for different people. This book, Sister Maiden Monster, is the weirdest, most effed up book I've ever read in my life. So it is horror, and it is like, it will freak you out and keep you up at night. And that's what good horror is, right? So if you like the spooky aspects of Alex's book, and you want to go deeper, I would do this one. If you like the cozy, like family aspects, I would do this one. And if you like the big epic fantasy, cool world building and magic systems, I would go with this one.
And then of course we have Alex's book on top.
Yes, this one.
Yeah.
Okay, I have one other book that I really want to mention. This is not out yet, but it's New Sons 2. It's a second volume of the short story anthology edited by Nisi Shawl, with all authors of color. And I have a story in there, but there are so many truly fantastic stories. I believe it comes out on March 14th.
Okay, so very soon. What a great cover too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I also have one more too, and it's the same sort of self-promotion. So the bookstore publishes books, which some people may or may not know. And so our most recent one, we just got the proofs in, and I'm so excited. It's called Carnival of Creatures. And I actually wrote it, and then I worked with a local author, a children's book illustrator, actually, an artist, and she did all the artwork, and it's amazing. And it's called Carnival of Creatures, and it is a compendium of Louisiana monsters of myth and legend for you to use in your tabletop RPG games. And so if you're into tabletop RPGs, you will definitely want this book. But also if you just like Louisiana monsters of lore and legend, it's a good compendium of them. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention it.
Excellent. So we'll put links to buying all these books from the store. Thank you for recommending them. Alex, what's next? Will we see a spin-off with Peaches, perhaps?
We might. That's not what I'm currently working on. But I am working on a continuation of the Dark Tome podcast. There's going to be a little special thing that comes out, I believe, in June, which will be very cool. I'm also hard at work on the next novel, but I can't say much about that quite yet.
We understand. For those of us who aren't up to speed on the podcast, can you tell us briefly what that is, the Dark Tome podcast?
The Dark Tome is this sort of indie podcast that was absorbed by Realm, and it's about this magic volume that can draw a reader into different stories. And so it gives podcast adaptations of a bunch of different authors' short stories. And it's one of my favorites, and I'm so glad to be working on a revival of that.
Excellent. So we will check that out, link below, and also keep our eyes open for news of your next novel. Good luck with that. I look forward to that. Yes, we Leah, one of our most consistent viewers, is talking about how much she always appreciates the book recommendations. So we do too.
I'm waiting for LeVar Burton to read one of your stories on his podcast.
Oh, you and me both. I would love that.
Well, thank you. Oh, one more question. The last question. I'm going to forget it and I can't. Candace, the last question of our show always goes to the bookseller. Please finish this sentence for us. Running a successful bookstore is part hard work, part luck, and part what?
Personality.
Personality. Ooh, that's a good one. We haven't heard that one before.
Oh, yeah. I mean, my store is all about personality. So that's what I say. Put yourself into it, and
yeah.
Your people will find you.
Excellent. Oh my gosh, it was so much fun talking with the two of you. I think if any of us are in the New Orleans area, we should absolutely have to stop by Tubby and Coo's, or if we're going on vacation, since so many people go to New Orleans, it seems like a stop at your bookstore is a must. That and some beignets, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we have beignets very close by the bookstore, so you can walk. You can get beignets and books.
And Alex, congratulations again on your wonderful novel. It's very special, and I'm excited for you and all the enthusiasm and success that's being directed toward it. It's very, very well deserved.
Thank you so much.
To our audience, if you liked today's show, and we certainly hope that you did, please subscribe to A Mighty Blaze on Facebook to get notified about all of our other events. If you're not a Facebook person, I get it. Please, in that case, please hop over to our website, amightyblaze.com, to sign up for a newsletter. It goes out once a week and gives a rundown of all of our shows. We'll be back next Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and for another episode of Authors Love Bookstores. Until then, be well and keep reading. Thank you.